Welcome to Leadership Luminaries Lounge with Kerry and Peggy O'Neill, a podcast about the connection of leadership, philosophy, practice, and impact on society. Get ready to be illuminated.
Welcome to our conversation today in the Leadership Luminaries Lounge. I'm here with Kerry Bass. We're colleagues and partners in this podcast series, and we're so happy to have you here today. And Kerry is going to introduce our guests.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here again with the Leadership Luminaries Lounge. Thank you, Peggy, for joining us again. It is my pleasure to introduce our special guest today. Today, we're going to continue our conversation on artificial intelligence, and more specifically, what does that mean to you? And so our guests today are some gentlemen, and as usual, I'm very use the people that I know, and I am really blessed to have some really important people and some really exciting people that have great amount of information, that being Dr. Arun Rai, the professor for computer information sciences and the director for the Center for Digital Innovation at Georgia State University. I have to admit, he was one of my professors in the Doctor of Business Administration program. He still talks to me even after allowing me to be in his class. And then a young data scientist that I've known for a few years here, Mr. Ed Chavis, the CEO of DibDob AI, and I'm going to let him explain what DibDob AI is. But Ed is one of those fantastic, those wizards of data, the data scientist. He has a Bachelor of Mathematics from Morehouse University, a Master's of Computer Information Sciences from Georgia State, a Master's in algorithmic, I can't remember the exact term, but a Master's from Georgia Tech in addition to that, and just also then got a certificate for strategic management at Georgetown. He's just one of those people that the degrees just keep rolling along. And so, Arun, why don't you introduce yourself a bit more and then tell us what gets you up in the morning and gives you joy?
Well, thank you, Kerry, and thanks, Peggy, for inviting me to this Leadership Luminaries Lounge. It's a pleasure to be here with you on this important conversation along with Ed. We live in exciting times, and I think at this point, there's so much of energy around understanding how artificial intelligence creates opportunities to take the potential of humans and organizations and realize them in ways that we have not. And I think that general, excitement factor from a research standpoint, from an education standpoint, from a partnering standpoint, fuels a lot of what we do in the Center for Digital Innovation. When I talk about the potential of the technology, I would be remiss in not pointing out that corresponding to the potential and bringing out the best in human and in organizations, that simultaneously we have to understand, appreciate, and proactively attend to the novel risks that emerge with this technology. So my own research and that of my colleagues and my students is very much at this intersection of artificial intelligence and its role in creating value in business and organizations in novel ways, and how business and society can attend to risks and mitigate them through interventions. They could be policy-based interventions, they could be technology-based interventions in organizations, upskilling and reskilling interventions in the workforce and such. So I won't belabor the point in terms of the specific projects, but we have a number of very interesting projects, some of which I hopefully will have a chance to share with everyone during the course of our conversation. But I'm delighted to be here and looking forward to the conversation. And I'll just make one final point. Kerry, having you as a student in the class was memorable and in a very positive way.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
And I would
course, of
say
course.
that, and I would say that it's a pleasure that you still talk to me as well. So, so I guess it's mutual that we end up having a lot of fun together. So that's great. Thank you.
Thanks. Ed.
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. Again, it's a pleasure to be here. I know we did something a while ago, which was super exciting. So again, Ed Chavis, my company is called DibDob AI, and it really stands for digitally innovating businesses and delivering operational breakthroughs. And so to talk a little bit about my company, we really focus on digital transformation. So what does that mean? It really is about helping clients, especially small and mid-size is where I really focus, enjoy the benefits of all this that is happening around them in the digital space, right? Cloud, you got AI, you got ML, you got chatbots, you got all these things that people are really trying to make sense of. You know, if you're a huge firm, huge company, you bring in a lot of consultants to help you with that. But for some of the smaller firms, they struggle with that, right? And they really are trying to figure out, you know, who can be my right consultant who really helps me through these challenges, really guides me and gives me the, you know, honest truth about different things. And really a lot of what I focus, you mentioned it earlier. I mean, from my initial days, I've been really working with data, you know, and, you know, to be honest with you, it's not so much that the algorithms have changed. It's the technology has changed, right? You used to have to get a laptop, well, not even a laptop, a server, and you VPN into a server and try to do some work. And now you got AWS. And so if you think about even GPT and OpenAI, a lot of what made them successful is that ability to scale up, right? And ingest corpuses and billions and billions of text to really understand and really start making sense. So the transformation, while we're focused on AI, the infrastructure that allows you to do that is where I really get excited about. And so a client may say, you know, I really want to understand how I can get here as it relates to AI. Well, now we need to talk about the people, processes, and technology that really drive your digital transformation. So where are you today? Where do you want to be tomorrow? What is that pathway to get there? And how do you bring the right resources in to help you each part along the way? And as Dr. Arun said, I mean, how do we drive value at each of those steps? How do we monetize? How do we understand? How do we really make sense of this? So, you know, we in the big data, when it was big Hadoop, you know, we got into the cycle of running nonstop POCs, proof of concepts that really delivered no value. And so, you know, people want value now. And they really want to say, if I'm going to do this AI, we're going to do all these different things that are exciting and it's on the news. What does that really do for my bottom line? How does that help, you know, my mission if I'm in a federal agency, and really try to figure that out. So that's where we fit. We really try to help, especially small and mid-sized companies, go on that journey.
Thank you. Thank you both. Lovely start to hear everything that y'all are involved in and how you're thinking about it. And I love, Arun, you saying that how a lot of your focus is on using AI in a way and thinking about it in a way that it brings out the human potential, that the human focus is present in what you and Ed are talking about today. So if you would start us out with you mentioned some risks. If you tell us maybe a few risks to get us started that you see with AI, what we should be aware of, and maybe also start getting into how do we manage those well. And maybe some of the projects you're talking about, maybe what's going to come in here. Well, I look forward to hearing what you say.
Absolutely, Peggy. Great question. So, you know, when you think about the risks, one of the more widespread risks that has received quite a bit of attention is around AI biases. So, for example, you know, you have the popularized bias of automated hiring tools where hiring decisions are made by systems, leveraging resumes of past candidates and past profiles of what may be successful. AI, being a prediction algorithm, of course, looks at what was present in past data and can that be used to predict a future instance of success or failure based on attributes on a CV. So Amazon's failed hiring tool essentially penalized women in terms of hiring success if there was something like a women's sports club or something like that that was present on a CV. The reason being, they just didn't have enough such cases in the data that were associated with success. So it's not causal, it's prediction based on associations, and there could be questions around representation of the data of relative to the world that we are trying to describe. So AI biases, for us to be sensitive that these are prediction and looking at the role of the data from which the AI learns in understanding that dependency becomes very critical. And we can talk more about how, fairness and bias issues are attended to. But I do want to make a point very quickly that when we talk about biases and fairness, this is a reasonably complex problem. When I use the term fairness, there are a number of different principles of AI fairness that could come in. Somebody could say, I'm interested in attending to procedural fairness, while somebody else could come back and say, I'm interested in attending to an outcome fairness in terms of whether the outcomes are equitable. Now, these two might be in contradiction and in some tension with each other. So I think there are a number of choices in dealing with and prioritizing what type of fairness one wants to attend to that requires, again, the human judgment to come into the loop. So it's not purely or only, or even as a leading aspect, a technology issue. It is a human values issue. We need to come back and ask the tough questions of what type of fairness are we trying to achieve? What does this actually mean in terms of the specific principles we want to prioritize? And then what measures might be there and what dependencies might be there with respect to the algorithm and the data. So I just want to identify this one big block of fairness, biases, and the complexity of attending to that, which I think is going to continue to be an ongoing endeavor for us in the technical side, in the social sciences side, in economics, in public policy, and so on and so forth. Just today, one of the federal departments issued issued guidance on, I think it was the housing group or whatever, and I can get back to that later, in terms of really auditing and understanding biases and fairness in these automated decision tools. The other one that I want to address very quickly is the issue around trust. And the reason I go to trust is you can have a risk on two sides, Peggy, right? You can under-trust or distrust an algorithm when you should trust it. Or you may actually do just the opposite, right? So you could end up in situations of not using an algorithm that you should, or over-relying on an algorithm that you shouldn't. So in a sense, understanding that human dynamic of trust, that the algorithms and the AI systems are not perfect, like any other human expert that you may have in the loop that you're consulting with. Even with physicians, we say, go get a second consultation because there's uncertainty. And I think we got to basically recognize that when we are dealing with these algorithms in complex domains, we cannot take them as certain and, de facto truth, that there is aspects of trust and trustworthiness that needs to be carefully calibrated, and educating the workforce to understand how to accomplish that appropriate calibration and trust becomes a huge consideration. I'll mention one more point here, and that is from an organizational standpoint, that there's a risk of not experimenting in an expedient manner. So a lot of these solutions are not ones that you're just going to pull off the shelf. You're going to have to realize and achieve complementarities between your other resources within your organization, your people, your processes, your customers, and a lot of your contextual settings. And therefore, the value proposition of AI turns to the complementary resources that interact with AI in a meaningful way, and experimenting and understanding how that happens. So there's this experimental risk, and not experimenting becomes a huge risk in a sense, right? So you got to experiment in context to figure out what works. So I'll sort of stop there. I mean, I could go on, but the fairness issue, the trust issue, and the experimentation need to understand the complementarities, to me, are three very big ones that I would like to identify just to, start off.
Well, I'm gonna see if this question works right now, which is, so what comes to mind, or what I'm curious about, so like this fairness, that not no, I mean that the information isn't there, like with regard to the woman applicant that you're talking about. How would people even know that? I mean, how like I might not even think about that, and I'm a woman, that, oh, this might be biased against me because it doesn't have a history of XYZ in there. How does that get countered, and how do we even let people know that those things are possibilities, and which ones are possibilities? Like, is everything that way? Do we just automatically think, well, we've got to check everything for fairness?
That's a great question. So, how one goes after mitigating, preventing, and detecting biases in AI systems. So sort of maybe I would reframe it as preventing, detecting, and mitigating biases. I mean, so you have a set of considerations that could be quite helpful. First is that purely from a development team standpoint, you want to have diversity in your development teams. You're going to get different insights in terms of how to think about the world that we are trying to represent with data and learn about, because we got diverse people with a diverse lens looking out at that world and looking in at the data that we are trying to represent that world with. I think that is critical. The second issue is when one develops algorithms essentially, and one has these models, to include bias detectors as part of the testing process. So in part of the testing process, for example, if indeed one tries to identify the attribute that is pretty, critical in predicting whether an applicant is going to be successful, is their experience level or their, knowledge base, etc., we would look at that and say, yeah, that sort of makes sense. But if it comes back and says, where did you kick the soccer ball last, comes up, you realize that it's picking up something else altogether. So going in and asking the question on which attributes are being, emphasized in a prediction process and why, is a natural reasoning process that needs to come into understanding the functioning of the attributes. So with advances in explainable AI, where one is able to get in and try to understand why and how an algorithm is making certain, a model is making certain prediction choices, can be quite illuminating. The final point I would make is to be sensitive that lab tests do not equal real world tests. Sometimes things can do great in the lab, but when you take it out into the real world, it's a lot more complex. So the testing process must include real world testing with a loop back into continual model refinement. So those would be three aspects I would hit, Peggy. You would see that they span a perspective in terms of the people, in terms of the technological approaches that are used as part of the model evaluation process and understanding it, and then not limiting testing only to a lab setting. So those would be 3 points I would make for my side.
Thank you.
Ed, what are you seeing from the clients and the deployments that you're already in, the pitfalls and how to avoid them?
Yeah, no, those are all great items. I was just, making some notes here. I think again, I like to look at the dichotomy of the commercial versus federal, and federal, state, local, and all those things. And I think on the federal side, state and local, people are really thinking about how do we have the right mixture, the right diversity, how do we test biases and things like that. I don't know that that's really happening commercially, right? And maybe at some of the bigger companies. I was reading an article, and I'm very into fintech, and so this trading company, one of their teams set up a model, said, "Hey, we can increase our revenues by 30%." And luckily, this organization had a model management, kind of a centralized organization. So if other groups start building models, they review and say, "Hey, is this acceptable?" And they stopped it. They said, "Hey, a lot of stuff that Dr. Arun was talking about, they didn't have the right enough history. Those parameters weren't consistent. They didn't have any testing to show that, this model is stable in any environment." And so they shut it down. But I think, when I think about risk, I think about, there's an arms race in AI, right? Within companies, because groups are saying to themselves, if I can show that I can drive value via AI, my budget's going to get bigger, right? I'm gonna hire more. My bonuses are going to be larger. So they're taking their teams and they're saying, hey, let's think about how we can drive, revenue, bottom line impacts, all these things. And they're really building models very quickly. And, it's kind of like, heard of shadow IT. It's like shadow AI, right? All these little groups are building these things that they're trying to productionalize. And if a company doesn't have all those things that, Arun talked about, and they put these things to production, yeah, there's going to be a lot of issues, right? There's going to be people who aren't given the opportunity for credit or whatever these things may be. The biases are going to be there. But what is the organization's, on the commercial side, who monitors that, right? When I think about banks, I think lawsuits, right? Years down the line, when someone realizes, hey, you know, this this group had been impacted because they never got loans or they never were part of this special deal. And so, on the commercial side, I think it's going to be a lot harder, right? To try to all these biases that we're talking about. How do we manage that? And I know the White House is thinking about that, but I just think that's going to be an issue. I think also, some of the deployment techniques that people are using just to get it out the door, they're not being tested. It's like releasing bad software. It's like Microsoft released bad software. This concept of AI engineering is making sure all these different steps are buttoned up and they're tested, and the model's going to be stable. All these things happening. And I think, no, right? I think a lot of people right now are just trying to get into the space, show that they can, do something really cool and, hopefully drive value. So I think as this moves on, because again, we went through this a lot, I think in .com, the big Hadoop, Hadoop was going to revolutionize everything. And now we're at this AI kind of inflection point. And so it's really, to me, about, and where I try to help my clients is all the things that Arun said, but then how do we make the right plans to do the right things, right? That's what they really need. They need that guidance that he's talking about on paper, and hopefully a roadmap to drive them further.
Thanks, Ed. I was just thinking about your comments there, and I was thinking of Peggy's background. I was thinking lawsuits. That's what's coming.
Yeah.
But I mean, that would be too bad if banks wait till they get lawsuits to get into this. So it's more how do we encourage them to do that now, or smaller businesses to do that now rather than waiting.
Well, I went to a financial conference in DC probably about a month ago. It was a government one, but I would say probably 40% were technologists, the 60% were lawyers. So they're all trying to understand the impacts and what does this mean and how do we get in front of it. One of the organizations, quasi-government that I work for now, it's all about AI. The lawyers are looking into it. So they're really trying to craft that approach from a lawyer, attorney perspective. Sorry.
So mentioning lawyers, if I could just identify one more risk out there, and that's with generative AI today, there's this whole thing about hallucination.
Yeah.
That it just makes up stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a case quite popularized at this point. It was in New York, where a judge reprimanded with sanctions 2 lawyers
Mm.
who in submitting their briefs and petitions had essentially pointed to cases in the past which never existed. They relied on ChatGPT to help them in drafting what they submitted. And so the judge puts it quite eloquently out there, saying that technology has been available, will continue to be available, but who is responsible? Who has the responsibility to verify this? And in this case, it was like the humans were responsible and they were negligent in their responsibility. So I think this whole hallucination space, and you can think about it in the context of education to medicine to what have you. On the one hand, you can end up with highly creative inputs which are provided to make us think in ways we haven't. But if we are looking at facts and which are just not facts, and we have fabricated stuff that's thrown at us, and we treat that as valid, then there's a big problem out there, and could also lead to all sorts of risks in just a wide variety of domains. So I just thought I would mention that.
Yeah, thanks. And that brings up another one that I kind of like to get your both perspective on. The deep fake aspect and that issue of truth and trust. It kind of relates to that. I'd like to get your thoughts on the risk and maybe some thoughts on how do we get to a point where you can believe what is being presented. I was going to say, can you believe what you see or what you hear anymore? Not necessarily. Why don't we start Ed and then Arun, and then we'll think about how do you take advantage of opportunities.
Yeah, no, I mean the deep fake is definitely a big issue, right? And be it voice, be it voice and picture. I mean, you can recreate people's the way they write. Everything can be recreated at some point. I do think it goes back to a lot of how are we validating these systems, right? And so just like historically any cyber crook or cyber criminal came about and tried to break into systems and do certain things, I think we have to think about these systems in that kind of end to end, right? So maybe there's certification organizations in the future or even now that say, hey, before you use something, it's got to be certified BBB or whatever it is, right? You probably have to really have organizations who look into these things, look and say, before someone uses, this tool or believes this, it's got to have some type of certification where people who are technologists and, like Dr. Arun, who can bring in that end-to-end diverse thought, say, hey, this is a system that we think makes sense because we've looked at the data, we looked at the testing, and so, it's accurate, if you will. And I think, if you think about it that way of, certifying systems, then when you see something that's not certified, right, then you can really say, hey, I'm not going to use this, just like you do now. Because remember back in the day, like spam, right? You get all these emails, you get all these things and they look real and say, oh, I'm going to win $1 million and all these things. Your email really takes care of most of that. If you go and look in your spam folder now, it knows what spam looks like. We're smart enough now that we can fight back. And of course, the criminals and people find new ways, and then you update that. I think it's going to be very similar for AI, right? There's kind of this AI spam filter or certification that things go through, and you feel more comfortable about it and you drive it. But to get there, I think all the things we've been talking about have to be in place, right? It has to be an end-to-end system. The right people have to, talk about it and understand it and bring it to a level that people can conceptually understand. And that diverse, and we really need, I'm not saying we don't need it in other places, but that diversity is really important here because it's so many ways you can use deep fakes that we need people with varied backgrounds, liberal arts people, all these different people who know about, the intonations and the different things that you might do if you're trying to recreate a voice or if someone moves, So we need that end to end, I think, system, the right people around it to understand it and really make suggestions. And then we need, I think, thirdly, some type of certification or group that authenticates this stuff as we move forward.
Arun, what are you thinking? And what, as you're coming on, I was thinking there's a old science fiction author, and there was a process that they called a fair witness, that these people that were designated in society to witness events and so forth, they were the designated truth. And so if a fair witness had seen it, then they knew, and you could count on that being accurate. Arun, what are you thinking?
So first, I think this is significant technological issue today. It has profound risks, but it also has significant opportunities. And we'll maybe just briefly talk about the risk side. When you consider what happened in New Hampshire, which is when we had the primaries, you might have seen President Biden's voice was essentially spoofed, and with a 20-second audio recording, you can now very quickly use somebody's voice to generate content in seemingly authentic manners to that individual. And that's really what happened. So then you had these robocalls, which were blasted all over, telling people don't bother to come and vote because it's a waste of your vote. And we've seen it on both sides, both the Republican and the Democratic side, in terms of the elections cycle, where deepfakes technology has been used to mislead citizens. So I think the issue for us to recognize here is that the risk for critical democratic processes and commercial processes are there with deepfakes. And it's not just a question about producing the deepfakes. These things can be disseminated at scale at very low cost. Third, they can be precision targeted. So if I knew people who are most vulnerable to a certain type of deepfake, I can target them now. A lot of this information is available out there. So it's this combo, this triad of being able to produce deepfakes, being able to disseminate them at scale, and to precision target the deepfakes. That's the problem. And so now the question is, what do we do about it in certain scenarios? And one can talk about where deepfakes can be advantageous, and that's a different side of the discussion. But in the state of Georgia, for example, and the other states where we have now passed a bill where indeed it's a felony to go ahead and mislead the electorate using deepfakes technology. So there are policy initiatives that might be taken, and there are some tensions along free speech versus this, and we're working through all of that through due democratic and debate process. But that's what's happening there. Like, this is too risky. And then comes the question of what's being done by the platforms. So the platforms, if you see, a number of the platforms today have techniques to first encourage people to voluntarily disclose if they used AI to generate ABC type of content. But they also have detectors to see whether through metadata or through some type of invisible watermarks or whatever's out there, whether the detectors can, flag something as AI generated, which can alert people, and then you can have a signaling value. You don't censor that content, but you essentially label that content as AI generated, and then you educate people in terms of how to process the potential risks of AI generated content. The final point I would make is that even on the production side, there are some technologies, specifically take a technology like what's now referred to as poison pill technology, where you can essentially have a poison pill that's embedded in as part of the content, restricting the ability of someone to utilize that content and mispurpose that content, if I may say. So there are things that can happen at different levels. And like a lot of these problems, I don't think you can look at it as saying this one solution fixes deepfakes in society. I just don't think that that's feasible. You got to have thinking at the policy levels, in terms of the platforms, in terms of the producers of the technology, and then you are able to come up with the right balance. And it's not going to be a once and done problem, but we have to keep playing with these different things and learning through that process. Those are my thoughts on this issue.
Yeah. Peggy, as we close out this part of our discussion, we're having such a rich discussion. We're going to have a dual session here too. But any other burning thoughts on this part before we close it out?
The only other risk that I would identify, which we have not mentioned, and I think from a legal standpoint, maybe we were implicit about it when we mentioned it, but I think it's important, and that's the intellectual property risk.
Yeah.
And in a sense, because things may be copyrighted material, may be pulled off by generative AI and things like that. But again, having the human in the loop there to understand the novel risks that can arise around things like copyrighted code. So for example, today in coding environments, right, Kerry, we have things like Copilot that are being used. And while Copilot might help people and help productivity of developers, it likely is very risky to put this in the hands of people who do not know the language or have understanding of the underlying programming libraries. You can use the tool to learn how to program. That's a different issue. But here, if you're in a production mode and you're like, well, I can just hit the snooze button and be very productive. That's not the way to go with this technology, because then you end up with copyright violation and whatnot. And, the human and the company bears the cost.
Absolutely.
So I do have, unless you're ready to move on, I do have. Yeah. So I think it can put it all in one question, which is, so one of my concerns is, if I understand AI correctly, is that what's in AI is everything that's existed up until now. So two things. One is, to create a different future, how do we separate that from AI? If we start really using AI to generate a lot of us for what we want for our businesses or for ourselves. Now, what about the future creativity, the unknown, the what AI should not know because it only knows what came before? So I'm concerned about that. And then the second is if people start relying on AI for so much of their content, what's that going to do to our creativity? Because as we know, if we don't use our abilities, like, for example, our inherent navigation ability that's been diminished quite a bit because we've relied on Google Maps so much. If we start relying on AI, then our inherent creativity, I'm afraid, is going to be sorely diminished. So what are you all thinking? And now that's also may fit into the opportunity portion, but those are some of my concerns as far as what it's going to do to humanity and a potential future that could be different from now.
Yeah, I mean, those are challenging questions, Peggy. It's the way I think about it is, the ability for AI to really predict the future, and that's an inflection point, right? A lot of what the LLMs, generative AI, takes what we know, right, and helps us really format that in a way that's easily digestible. But that next step of saying, well, what should be next? I mean, that's a big leap, right? I mean, that's as I mentioned, an inflection point. And I'll be honest, just thinking about that, I think of it as a positive, right? I think, the way I've always heard it working with companies is that, the AI will be my co-pilot, right? And so at this point, I'm able to think about things that I haven't been able to think about. There's this next level of intellectual thought that people think we'll get to, with AI as our co-pilot, because all the other things that we spent time trying to build and get together, get through manual processes and things of that nature will be automated for us. I think about some really interesting ways of developing code or deploying systems in a much more kind of, ubiquitous, edge-centric, real-time system awareness approaches, right? And so some of those things we're limited by right now due to, the cost of computing and things of that nature. So, I know this is not a real answer, but I just think at the end of the day, AI as our co-pilot will hopefully allow us to do more and more interesting things, right? And ideally, those things will help us have a better way of living. If you think about climate change and all those different things, maybe we start looking at the data and say, hey, here's really optimal ways to live that really help the environment, and we can deploy this at scale, right? So there's all these higher level challenges that we just haven't been able to solve. And I think that's where we're thinking AI will help, bridge that gap for us.
Arun, any thoughts before we in that area before we start thinking about the next phase in our second half of the conversation?
Yeah, I think Ed, I would just echo Ed's comments here. I do think that you could look at it both ways, and we need to consider both sides. Peggy, to your point, that AI essentially diminishes the human element in terms of the worlds that we create, the worlds in which we will live in the future. The other is that it is the combination of human and AI that creates these unparalleled new opportunities and pathways to address these very hard, thorny problems. Think about poverty, think about inequity, think about, polarization in society. I mean, these are hard problems and they haven't gone away. If anything, some of these problems have become more and more thorny over time.
Yep.
So, how do we create these possibilities where humans perform in what they are truly endowed with and can leverage to their fullest potential, while AI learns in ways that are different from us, but also is augmentative to us? So that's sort of, maybe we'll come into it in the second segment. Kerry, I won't belabor the point, but that's sort of where I see the tension, that you can see it as constraining creativity. And there have been studies where it has been shown that the most talented and most creative people using certain types of AI became less creative because of reliance on AI. And the lower spectrum of creative individuals increased in creativity. So there might be an asymmetric distribution on who benefits more, who might even get suppressed or diminished in the process. But I think that's looking at the technology as we know it today. The technology and how we are interacting with is vastly changing in terms of where we are going forward. And maybe as we step into the next segment, it's not just looking at the technology where we are and where we have been, but also where we are going in terms of the future potential that it's creating.
We continue to have a really great discussion, and we're going to break it at this point. And our guests have been Dr. Arun Rai and Mr. Edward Chavis as we continue discussion on AI. And so in our next segment, I'm really excited about, because that's the piece that I get excited about, is what are we going to be able to do with these new tools?